The chandeliers of the Metro General Grand Ballroom cast a crystalline glow, refracting light across a sea of black ties and silk gowns. It was the hospital's annual fundraising gala, an evening dedicated to the delicate art of extracting seven-figure donations from the city's philanthropic elite. Dr. Amara Johnson stood near a marble column, nursing a glass of sparkling water, a quiet island in the glittering archipelago of power brokers and old money. She wore a simple, elegant navy dress, a stark contrast to the couture that surrounded her. But her posture was as impeccable as any heiress's. She was observing, listening, feeling the currents of influence that decided which departments received funding and which were quietly starved into obsolescence. She had been speaking with Mr. Albright, a retired tech mogul whose foundation was a major source of research funding. Their conversation was productive, focused on the promising results of a new minimally invasive cardiac procedure her team was pioneering. Albright, a man who appreciated data and directness, was visibly impressed. "Remarkable, Doctor," he was saying, his eyes bright with interest. "Truly remarkable. We should schedule a proper meeting to discuss how the Albright Foundation can support this work." Before Amara could respond, a shadow fell over them. Arthur Vance, a senior trustee and the heir apparent to the hospital's CEO position, materialized with the effortless grace of a man who believed every room belonged to him. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his smile a brilliant, predatory white. He was a portrait of corporate charisma, a man who could speak of budget cuts with the same soothing tone one might use to describe a sunset. He placed a proprietary hand on Mr. Albright's shoulder, completely ignoring Amara. "Charles, my friend, I've been looking all over for you. The mayor is desperate for a word." He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial murmur loud enough for Amara to hear. "Something about a new civic partnership. Your name is at the top of the list, of course." Vance then turned his attention to Amara, his gaze sweeping over her with a polite, dismissive appraisal that took less than a second. He didn't recognize her. He saw only a woman in a simple dress, who was taking up the valuable time of a major donor. With a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he gently but firmly placed a hand on her elbow, beginning to steer her away from Albright, as if she were a misplaced piece of furniture. "So sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "I'm sure you understand. Charles has a very demanding schedule tonight." He gave her a confidential wink, a gesture meant to create a shared, demeaning secret. "We have to be careful. Sometimes the charity cases get a little lost and wander into the wrong rooms." The words, veiled as a light-hearted joke, struck Amara with the force of a physical blow. The glittering ballroom, the murmur of conversation, the scent of expensive perfume, it all faded away, replaced by the ghost of another room, another time. She was 16 again, sitting in the cramped, beige office of her high school guidance counselor. She had just shared her dream of becoming a heart surgeon. The counselor, a weary woman with tired eyes, had leaned back in her chair, a pitying smile on her face. "Amara, let's be realistic," she had said, her voice dripping with condescension. "People like you need to aim for something more practical, a vocational program. Perhaps college is not for everyone. People like you." Charity cases. The same sentiment, separated by 2 decades of relentless work, sacrifice, and achievement. For a fleeting moment, the carefully constructed walls around her heart threatened to crumble. The rage, cold and sharp, was a familiar phantom, but she had learned long ago that reacting was a luxury she couldn't afford. Emotion was a weapon her opponents used against her. So she did what she had trained herself to do in the operating room. When a patient's heart faltered, she became perfectly still, perfectly calm. She allowed him to guide her a single step before she stopped, planting her feet with an unmovable solidity that surprised him. She slowly, deliberately, removed his hand from her arm. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, met his. She said nothing. Her silence was more profound, more unnerving than any shouted retort could have been. It was a practiced defense, a shield forged in the fires of 1,000 slights, honed over a lifetime of being underestimated. Mr. Albright, looking uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Arthur, this is Dr. Amara Johnson, the hospital's chief of cardiac surgery. We were just discussing her department's groundbreaking new valve replacement technique." A flicker of confusion, then dawning horror, crossed Arthur Vance's face. He tried to recover, his charismatic smile snapping back into place. But it was too late. The mask had slipped. In that one unguarded moment, Amara had seen the truth of him. This wasn't just a careless comment from a man who didn't recognize her. This was who he was. "Dr. Johnson," Vance said, his voice a fraction too loud. "My sincerest apologies. A terrible mistake. With so many new faces." He let the sentence trail off, hoping his status would be enough to smooth over the insult. Amara offered him a small, chillingly neutral nod. "No mistake at all. Mr. Vance," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the resonant authority of a surgeon in her own theater. "You were perfectly clear." She turned back to Mr. Albright. Her composure absolute. "As I was saying, Charles, the preliminary data shows a 92% reduction in recovery time. I'll have my office send you the full brief on Monday." She excused herself with a poise that left both men standing in stunned silence. As she walked away, the practiced calm remained on her face, a perfect facade. But inside, a decision had been made. For years, she had endured the paper cuts of institutional bias, the condescension, the quiet challenges to her authority. She had fought by being better, by working harder, by letting her results speak for themselves. But Arthur Vance's casual cruelty had not been a paper cut. It had been the final, deliberate slice across an old wound. This wasn't the first offense, but it would be the last. The fight was no longer about proving her worth. It was about dismantling the system that gave men like him the power to question it in the first place. Amara's life was an architecture of defiance, built brick by painful brick against the gravity of low expectations. Her memories were not soft focus montages, but a series of stark, defining images. She remembered the cramped apartment she shared with her mother and younger brother. The scent of antiseptic from her mother's nursing uniforms, a constant presence. She remembered studying for her AP exams by the flickering light of a single lamp at the kitchen table. The sounds of the city, a distant, chaotic symphony outside their window. Her mother worked double shifts at a city clinic, her body slowly breaking under the strain of a system that demanded everything and gave back barely enough to survive. The defining tragedy came when Amara was 17. Her mother, who had diagnosed countless patients with the flu, ignored her own persistent cough and fatigue for months. By the time she finally collapsed during a shift, the diagnosis was late-stage pneumonia, complicated by a previously undiagnosed heart condition, in an underfunded, overcrowded hospital. She became just another patient in a long line. Another statistic. Amara sat by her bedside for 3 days, watching the life drain from the woman who was her entire world. A victim of the very healthcare disparities she fought against every day. It was in that sterile, beige room, holding her mother's cooling hand, that Amara's ambition crystallized from a dream into a vow. She wouldn't just become a doctor. She would become a surgeon, a master of the heart, the one organ that had failed her mother. She would gain the power and position to ensure that no one else's mother died because the system was too broken to care. Medical school was a crucible. She was one of only a handful of black women in her class, a constant object of curiosity and skepticism. Professors called on her less, questioned her answers more. Study groups formed without her. She was an outsider, forced to rely on nothing but her own intellect and an iron will. She graduated in the top 5% of her class. Her residency was even more brutal, a relentless gauntlet of 36-hour shifts, life and death decisions, and the subtle, pervasive bias that colored every interaction. She learned to be twice as prepared, twice as precise. Her work flawless to a degree that left no room for criticism. Her ambition wasn't just about success, it was about survival. Now, as chief of cardiac surgery at Metro General, she had reached a pinnacle few thought she could. But the hospital was its own complex ecosystem, a place of savage politics hidden beneath a veneer of professional courtesy. At the top of this food chain was Arthur Vance. On the surface, he was the hospital's golden boy, handsome, charming, and a master fundraiser. He was being groomed by the board to take over as CEO. He spoke eloquently about innovation and efficiency. But Amara knew his true language was profit margins. His vision for Metro General was a sleek, corporate machine, a 5-star medical facility for those who could afford it, with patient care for the less fortunate seen as a regrettable but necessary line item on the expense report. Her greatest ally, and her most persistent worrywart, was Dr. Ben Carter. Ben was a relic from a different era of medicine, a semi-retired cardiothoracic surgeon who had taken a young, fiercely determined Amara under his wing during her fellowship. He was her mentor, her confidant, and the closest thing she had to a father. His office was a cluttered, book-lined sanctuary, a stark contrast to the minimalist, glass-walled spaces of the hospital's new administrative wing. The Monday after the gala, Amara sat across from him, a cup of untouched tea growing cold in her hands. She recounted the incident with Vance, her voice devoid of emotion, a clinical report of an observed event. Ben listened, his weathered face etched with concern. He ran a hand through his shock of white hair. "I warned you about him. Amara. The man's a shark who thinks he's a philanthropist. He sees patients as customers and doctors as service providers." "It was more than that. Ben," Amara said, her voice quiet. "It was the way he looked at me, as if I was an error in his perfectly curated world." "Because you are," Ben said, leaning forward. "You represent everything he disdains. You built your career on skill, not connections. You champion causes that don't show up in the black on a ledger. You run the community outreach clinic, his biggest pet peeve, and you do it successfully. You are a threat to his entire worldview." He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "He's been gunning for you for a while." Quietly. This time, he just said the quiet part out loud. "Be careful. A man like that, when embarrassed, doesn't apologize. He retaliates." Ben's words were prophetic. The first shot was fired 2 days later. It arrived not with a bang, but with the sterile whisper of a corporate email. The subject line was innocuous: Q3 budget review and departmental optimization. The email, sent from the chief financial officer, but clearly bearing Vance's fingerprints, announced a comprehensive review of all hospital programs. It highlighted the need for fiscal responsibility and strategic reallocation of resources. Buried in the third paragraph was the target: the Metro General Community Wellness Clinic, a satellite facility in a low-income neighborhood that Amara had founded and championed for years. It provided free screenings, preventative care, and health education to thousands of people who would otherwise fall through the cracks. To Vance, it was a financial black hole. To Amara, it was the fulfillment of the promise she'd made at her mother's bedside. The email stated the clinic was being considered for closure, due to unsustainable operating costs. A second email followed an hour later. This one was from Human Resources, informing her that the cardiac surgery department had been selected for a standard performance review. The language was coded, full of corporate jargon about evaluating cost-effectiveness per procedure and benchmarking surgical outcomes against financial inputs. It was a direct assault on her professional integrity, a subtle suggestion that her focus on complex, often uninsured, cases was not fiscally prudent. She was being told that saving the wrong kind of lives was bad for business. She knew this was Vance's work. The gala had been the spark. And this was the fire. He wasn't just trying to sideline her. He was trying to dismantle her life's work. Piece by piece. She could fight it through official channels. But Ben's warning echoed in her mind. The system was rigged in Vance's favor. He was the future of the hospital. She was a principled obstruction. That evening, as she was leaving the hospital, a young nurse named Chloe intercepted her near the staff exit. Chloe's sister had been one of Amara's patients. A complicated, open-heart surgery that other doctors had deemed too risky. Amara had saved her life. "Dr. Johnson," Chloe said, her voice low, her eyes darting nervously around the hallway. She pressed a folded piece of paper into Amara's hand. "I overheard something. In the trustees' lounge. Mr. Vance was talking to two of the other board members." Amara unfolded the note in the quiet of her car. Chloe's handwriting was a rushed scrawl. He said, "It's time to prune the dead weight. Johnson and her charity projects are a liability. We'll start with the clinic. Then we'll audit her department into the ground. By the time I'm done, she won't be able to get a job swabbing floors in this hospital." The words were cold, brutal, and clarifying. This was not a business decision. This was a vendetta. The anonymous tip confirmed her suspicions, transforming the conflict from a political battle into a personal war. Sitting in the sterile silence of the parking garage, the engine of her car off, Amara felt the last vestiges of her defensive posture melt away. She had spent her entire life reacting, overcoming, and proving herself within a system designed to exclude her. No more. She would no longer play defense. She would no longer counter their moves. She would change the game entirely. She would stop trying to prove she belonged in their world and start building a world where men like Arthur Vance could not hold power. She drove home, and for the first time since the gala, she began to formulate a strategy. It would not be a war of memos and meetings. It would be a quiet, meticulous campaign fought in the shadows, using the very tools of precision and analysis that made her a world-class surgeon. She was going to dissect Arthur Vance's career, find the sickness at its core, and cut it out. Amara believed in institutions, in the order and logic of established systems. It was the same faith that guided her hands in the operating room, a trust in protocol, data, and procedure. Her first move against Vance, therefore, was to play by the rules. She would give the system one last chance to prove it could regulate itself. She spent the next week compiling a formidable defense. She worked late into the night, her apartment lit by the glow of her laptop, transforming her surgical precision into an analytical weapon. For the community clinic, she prepared a 200-page report filled with charts, graphs, and human stories. She demonstrated that for every dollar the hospital spent on the clinic's preventative care, it saved $7 in emergency room visits and uninsured critical care admissions. She included testimonials from patients, letters from community leaders, and data proving the clinic had lowered infant mortality rates in its district by 15%. It was an airtight case, appealing not just to morality, but to the very fiscal responsibility Vance claimed to champion. For her department, she compiled surgical outcome statistics that were among the best in the nation. She cross-referenced her team's success rates with national averages, highlighting their expertise in high-risk cases that other hospitals wouldn't touch. She proved that her department's cost-effectiveness, when measured in lives saved and long-term patient health, was unparalleled. The board meeting was held in a top-floor conference room with a panoramic view of the city, a sterile, intimidating space designed to reinforce the power of those who sat around its polished mahogany table. Amara was granted 15 minutes on the agenda. She stood before the board, a dozen men and one woman, their faces impassive, their suits uniformly dark and expensive. Arthur Vance sat near the head of the table, a picture of calm confidence. Amara delivered her presentation with cool, clinical clarity. She didn't plead or emote. She simply stated facts, building her case with an irrefutable wall of data. When she finished, the room was silent. She had left them no logical reason to proceed with Vance's proposals. Then, Arthur Vance spoke. He didn't challenge her data. He didn't dispute her facts. Instead, he did something far more insidious. He stood up, a look of paternal concern on his handsome face. "Thank you, Dr. Johnson," he began, his voice radiating warmth and reason. "We all appreciate your passion. Your dedication to these causes is truly admirable." He paused, letting the condescending compliment hang in the air. "But I believe we are missing the forest for the trees. This isn't about one clinic or one department. This is about the long-term fiscal health of this entire institution." He walked slowly around the table, his movements practiced and commanding. "Dr. Johnson has presented a very emotional case, and I understand that. Her personal connection to these projects is deep, but as trustees, our duty is to make decisions with our heads, not our hearts." He turned her strength, her passion, into a weakness, framing her as compromised by feeling. "She speaks of saving the hospital money in the long run," Vance continued. "But we are facing a crisis in the here and now. We need to be lean, efficient, and forward-thinking." He turned to his allies on the board, men who owed him for past favors, for lucrative contracts steered their way. "Are we a hospital, or are we a social services agency? We cannot be all things to all people. Tough choices must be made." He masterfully reframed the entire debate. It was no longer about data versus opinion. It was about pragmatic leadership versus emotional attachment. He made Amara seem like a naive idealist, a gifted surgeon who simply didn't understand the complex realities of running a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. He made himself look like the responsible adult in the room. When the vote was called, it was a foregone conclusion. Her complaint was dismissed. The performance audit of her department would proceed. The fate of the clinic would be decided by a subcommittee that Vance himself would chair. She had been outmaneuvered, her flawless logic rendered irrelevant by political power. The meeting was a masterclass in institutional gaslighting, a polite, sterile process that made her feel like she was the one being unreasonable. She walked out of the boardroom and into the empty hallway, the sound of the heavy door clicking shut behind her. The polished marble floor reflected her solitary figure. She wasn't angry. The time for anger was past. She felt a profound, chilling clarity. She had presented the system with a clear, logical choice, and the system had protected its own. It had chosen the charismatic, well-connected man over the unassailable truth. This failure was not a defeat. It was a diagnosis. The system wasn't just sick. Its corruption was malignant. It couldn't be treated with data and appeals to reason. It had to be excised. Standing in that silent, opulent hallway, Amara Johnson, the surgeon, knew what she had to do. She had tried to heal the institution from within, using its own rules. Now, she would have to operate on it from the outside. Without its consent, the quiet war had begun. Amara's apartment transformed into a war room. The minimalist decor was now cluttered with whiteboards, legal pads, and financial documents. Her campaign against Arthur Vance would be fought on two fronts. By day, she was Dr. Johnson, the consummate professional, performing complex surgeries with unwavering focus, mentoring residents, and navigating the treacherous currents of hospital politics with a serene, unreadable calm. By night, she became an investigator, meticulously piecing together the puzzle of Arthur Vance's life. Her greatest assets were the people whose lives she had saved. They were a network of grateful, powerful individuals who owed her the ultimate debt. Her first call was to David Chen, a tech CEO in Silicon Valley, whose daughter Amara had operated on years ago. "Amara, whatever you need," David said, his voice warm with gratitude. "You gave me my daughter back. The word no isn't in my vocabulary when it comes to you." "I need information." "David," Amara said, her voice low. "Everything you can find on a man named Arthur Vance. Financial records, business dealings, connections. Anything that's on the public record. And anything that's hidden just beneath it." David, a master of data mining and digital forensics, set his best people on the task. Within days, information began to flow in encrypted files, detailed reports on shell corporations, and a map of Vance's intricate network of political and financial alliances. Her next call was to Elena Rodriguez, a formidable defense attorney whose husband's life Amara had saved with a last-minute emergency surgery. Elena helped her understand the legal frameworks, advising her on what kind of evidence would be needed to prove a conflict of interest or breach of fiduciary duty. "If you're going after a man like Vance, you can't just wound him." "Amara," Elena warned, "you have to build a case so airtight that he has no path to recovery. It has to be a kill shot." The contrast in Amara's life became stark and cinematic. One afternoon, she stood in the sterile, brightly lit operating room, her hands steady as she performed a delicate coronary artery bypass. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the room's only soundtrack. Here, she was in absolute control, a master of her craft, her world reduced to the life-giving precision of the scalpel. Every movement was deliberate, every decision backed by years of knowledge. That same evening, she stood in the suffocating opulence of a donor's penthouse apartment, the air thick with the scent of lilies and privilege. It was a small, exclusive dinner party, and Arthur Vance was the guest of honor. She had been invited at the last minute, a token inclusion as a department head. She had to navigate a minefield of veiled insults and social traps, her mind working as hard as it did in the operating room. Vance approached her by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He held a glass of champagne, his smile as polished as his shoes. "Dr. Johnson," he said, his tone dripping with false cordiality, "I'm so glad you could make it. It's a testament to your resilience that you've come so far. Isn't it?" The words were a masterpiece of condescension, a polite microaggression designed to remind her of her origins, to frame her success as an anomaly. Amara met his gaze, her expression placid. "Resilience is a prerequisite for any surgeon." "Mr. Vance," she replied, her voice even, "as is a meticulous attention to detail, one learns that small, overlooked things can often be the most consequential." It was a coded response, a subtle warning that she was watching, that she saw what lay beneath his polished surface. He was momentarily taken aback, unused to anyone, let alone her, returning his volley with such unnerving precision. To increase the pressure on her, Vance began to target those around her. His chosen pawn was Dr. Lena Ortiz, a brilliant but insecure junior resident whom Amara had taken under her wing. Lena was the first in her family to become a doctor, A young woman of color navigating the same institutional headwinds Amara had faced a generation earlier. Vance summoned Lena to his office, a cavernous space with intimidatingly modern furniture. He offered her a fast-tracked path to a prestigious cardiothoracic fellowship, a career-making opportunity that would normally take years to earn. "You have immense potential, Dr. Ortiz," Vance said, his voice like a reassuring balm. "Dr. Johnson is an excellent surgeon, of course, but her methods are a bit old-fashioned. Her department is resistant to the kind of modernizing, efficiency-minded changes this hospital needs to make." He leaned forward, the offer becoming explicit. "The fellowship committee values honest feedback from its residents. A report detailing some of the inefficiencies in the cardiac surgery department would go a long way toward securing your spot." Lena was thrown into a moral crisis. The offer was a dream come true. But she knew what Vance was asking her to do: betray her mentor. She came to Amara's office late one night, her face pale with distress, and confessed everything. Amara listened without judgment. She saw not a potential traitor, but a younger version of herself, caught in an impossible position. "He's not offering you an opportunity, Lena," Amara said gently. "He's trying to buy your integrity, and it's the one thing you have that's not for sale. We are not defined by the traps people set for us. We are defined by how we choose to navigate them." She assured Lena that her career would not suffer, that she would protect her. The incident solidified Amara's resolve. Vance hadn't just attacked her. He had tried to corrupt the future she was trying to build. The stakes were no longer just personal. They were generational. The quiet war continued for weeks. Data flowed in from David Chen's team. Amara cross-referenced financial reports with board meeting minutes, uncovering a pattern of Vance steering hospital contracts to companies in which he held hidden interests. It was unethical, but skillfully concealed. She had evidence of greed, but she needed something more. She needed to understand the why. The viciousness of his campaign felt too personal to be just about power or money. There was a heat to it, a burning obsession that a simple corporate rivalry couldn't explain. She was missing the source of the malignancy. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday night. Amara was sifting through a mountain of data. David Chen's team had unearthed old news articles, public records, archived legal documents from a decade prior. She was looking for financial ties, for any hidden vulnerability. Her eyes, tired and strained, scanned a digitized newspaper from 10 years ago. It was a small article from the city's secondary paper, a human interest piece buried in the metro section. The headline read, "Local family mourns tragic hospital death." She almost skipped past it, but one name caught her eye. The article detailed the sudden, unexpected death of a young woman named Eleanor Vance, following a high-risk emergency surgery at Metro General. The piece quoted her grieving, distraught brother, who spoke of a system that had failed his sister. His name was Arthur Vance. Amara felt the air leave her lungs. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She clicked on the link to the official hospital incident report, which was part of the public record: the date, the time, the attending surgeon on call for the trauma unit that night. It all came rushing back. A memory she had compartmentalized and buried under a decade of other cases. Other faces. Other tragedies. She was no longer in her quiet apartment. She was back in the chaotic, blood-spattered reality of her final year of residency. Eleanor Vance had been in a catastrophic car accident, brought to the ER with massive internal injuries. It was an impossible case. A desperate Hail Mary surgery. Amara, the senior resident on duty, had led the team. They had fought for hours, a frantic, desperate battle against insurmountable odds. But the damage was too severe. Eleanor had died on the table. A full review had been conducted. It was declared an unpreventable death. Amara and her team were officially cleared of any wrongdoing, their actions deemed heroic under the circumstances. But the memory that surfaced now with chilling clarity was not of the surgery itself, but of the aftermath. A young man, his face contorted with rage and grief, had cornered her in the hospital corridor. He was screaming, his voice raw with pain, calling her incompetent, a killer. He shouted that a young black resident shouldn't have been allowed to operate on his sister, that she was an affirmative action quota filler who had cost his sister her life. That man, his face a mask of hatred, had been a younger, unpolished Arthur Vance. Everything clicked into place. The puzzle pieces, scattered and confusing, now formed a single, horrifying picture. His dismissiveness at the gala, his relentless campaign to destroy her clinic, his attempts to ruin her professional reputation. It wasn't about corporate strategy or systemic bias or a simple power play. It had never been about any of that. This was revenge. His entire career, his climb onto the hospital board, his meticulous maneuvering toward the CEO position, it had all been a long, patient, calculated game. He wasn't trying to build a more profitable hospital. He was trying to gain enough power to destroy the woman he blamed for his sister's death. He had spent a decade building a weapon, and that weapon was Metro General, and it was aimed directly at her heart. The revelation was staggering. It reframed every interaction, every veiled insult, every political maneuver. He wasn't just an antagonist. He was a man hollowed out by grief and consumed by a misplaced, 10-year-old vendetta. The fight had just become infinitely more dangerous because she wasn't fighting a rational corporate adversary. She was fighting a ghost. Armed with the devastating truth, Amara felt a profound sense of isolation. The weight of Vance's decade-long hatred was a suffocating burden. There was only one person she could share it with, one person who might have seen the pieces of this puzzle before she did. She went to Ben Carter's office the next morning. She laid it all out for him, the old news article, the incident report, the memory of a grieving brother in the hallway. As she spoke, she watched Ben's face. He wasn't surprised. He looked weary, pained, and, to her shock, guilty. When she finished, the silence in the book-lined office was heavy. "You knew," Amara said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Ben couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at his hands, folded on his cluttered desk. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I knew. Not at first, but a few years ago, when Vance was appointed to the board. I recognized the name. I looked into it. I saw the connection." "And you didn't tell me," Amara's voice was laced with a hurt that was sharper than anger. "Ben, for years he's been chipping away at me, at my work. You let me believe it was just hospital politics." "I was trying to protect you." Ben's voice rose, filled with a desperate defensiveness. "Amara, this man is not rational on the subject of you. He is obsessed. I saw the look in his eyes back then. It was pure hatred. I thought if you didn't know, if you just kept your head down and did your work, he might eventually move on. I didn't want you to know you were working in the same building as a man who has been hunting you for 10 years. I didn't want you to live with that fear." His intentions may have been protective, but the result was a profound betrayal. He had left her to fight a monster without ever telling her its name. The trust between them, the bedrock of her professional life, fractured. "Protection," she said, her voice cold. "You left me unarmed. Ben, that's not protection. That's negligence." She stood up and walked out of his office. The rift between them a silent, gaping chasm. She had never felt more alone. Vance, sensing he was losing ground in the political battle, escalated his attacks. He decided to take the fight public. A story appeared on a little-known medical watchdog blog, a site known for its sensationalist and often unsubstantiated claims. The article was a masterpiece of innuendo. It didn't name Amara or Eleanor Vance, but the details were specific enough for anyone inside the hospital to understand. It spoke of a prominent surgeon at a major downtown hospital with a troubling history, alluding to a past incident during her residency that raised serious questions about competence. It hinted that the hospital board was currently reviewing her department for performance issues. The story, planted and amplified by a public relations firm Vance had hired, was picked up by a local television news station. Suddenly, Amara's reputation was under siege. Colleagues who had once been friendly now offered her strained smiles in the hallway. Nurses whispered as she walked past. The cloud of suspicion, however baseless, was beginning to affect her authority. The pressure was immense, a constant, grinding weight on her shoulders. She was at a moral crossroads. She had the truth, the full story of Vance's vendetta. She could go public with it, expose him as a man driven by a personal grudge. She could leak the story of Eleanor Vance and his misplaced blame. But she knew how he would spin it. He would paint her as a cornered doctor, lashing out with a personal attack to deflect from a professional review. He would accuse her of exploiting his family's tragedy for her own gain. It would become a messy, public feud, his word against hers. It might work, but it would be a victory won in the mud, a victory that would compromise her own principles. She spent a sleepless night in her apartment, the city lights twinkling below, a silent audience to her turmoil. She could destroy him with anger and accusation, meeting his ugly war with one of her own. Or she could find another way, a better way, a way to defeat him that wasn't just about winning, but about reaffirming everything she stood for: truth, integrity, and a profound respect for the sanctity of life and memory. By dawn, she had made her choice. She would not fight his fire with fire. She would fight it with light. She would not expose his vendetta as an act of revenge. She would reveal it as a tragedy. And in doing so, she would not only defeat him, but transcend the very hatred that fueled him. The final board meeting was an event of orchestrated grandeur, held in the hospital's largest auditorium to accommodate trustees, department heads, and major donors. It was less a meeting and more a coronation. The agenda was a formality. The primary purpose of the gathering was to officially announce Arthur Vance as the next CEO of Metro General Hospital. He sat at the center of the long table on the stage, beaming, accepting congratulations, the very picture of a man who had reached the summit of his ambition. The proceedings began with tedious financial reports and self-congratulatory speeches. Amara sat in the front row, a senior department head, her face a mask of serene composure. She waited. When the chairman finally announced the last item on the agenda, the CEO appointment, Amara stood. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice calm but clear, carrying through the silent auditorium. "With the board's permission, as Chief of Cardiac Surgery, I request 5 minutes to make a special presentation on a matter of urgent institutional importance. The topic is institutional risk and patient trust." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a highly unusual request. The chairman, surprised, looked to Vance. Vance gave a magnanimous wave of his hand. "Of course," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "Let's hear what the good doctor has to say." He was enjoying this, believing it to be her last, desperate, futile protest. Amara walked to the podium. She did not look at Vance. She addressed the board, the donors, the entire room. She began not with an attack, but with a cold, data-driven analysis. On the large screen behind her, Charts and graphs appeared. For the past 18 months, she began, under the increasing influence of Mr. Vance's financial strategies, Metro General has seen a 22% increase in malpractice insurance premiums, directly linked to a 34% increase in patient complaints regarding premature discharge. She clicked to the next slide. Staff turnover in our nursing department has reached a 5-year high, with exit interviews citing a corporate culture that prioritizes throughput over patient care. Our liability exposure has, according to the hospital's own risk management department, tripled. She presented a cool, irrefutable case, using Vance's own language of finance and risk against him. She showed evidence of contracts he had steered to companies with which he had conflicts of interest, costing the hospital millions. The mood in the room began to shift from celebratory to tense. Vance's smile became fixed, strained. Then, Amara's tone softened. But financial risk is not the greatest danger we face, she said. The greatest risk is a compromise of judgment at the highest level of leadership. A compromise driven not by strategy, but by a deeply personal, unresolved trauma. On the screen, a photograph of a smiling young woman appeared. "This is Eleanor Vance," Amara said softly. 10 years ago. She died on my operating table during my residency. It was a tragedy, an unpreventable death that has haunted me, and her family, ever since. A collective gasp went through the auditorium. Arthur Vance shot to his feet. "This is outrageous. She's trying to deflect from her own professional failings by dragging my family's tragedy into this." Amara held up a hand, not to silence him, but to ask for a moment more. "Mr. Vance is right," she said, her voice filled with a surprising empathy. "It is a tragedy so profound that for 10 years, he has been driven by a single, all-consuming purpose to hold me accountable for his sister's death. His entire career at this hospital, his climb to this very stage, has been a vendetta. His judgment has not been guided by what is best for this hospital, but by a catastrophic conflict of interest. He is a man compromised by his own grief." She didn't frame it as an attack. She framed it as a diagnosis. Vance was stunned into silence, his narrative ripped away from him. The board was in an uproar, but Amara wasn't finished. This was not the final blow. It was the setup. "But this story is not just about Mr. Vance's pain," she continued. "It is also about how we choose to honor the memory of those we lose." She clicked to the final slide. The screen filled with documents, financial records, bank statements, and official letters from a foundation. "For the past 10 years, Amara announced, I have been anonymously funding a scholarship in Eleanor Vance's name. The Eleanor Vance Memorial Scholarship for Women in Surgery has, to date, paid for the full medical school tuition of 5 brilliant young female surgeons." On the screen appeared photos of the 5 recipients, smiling, confident young women in their scrubs and white coats. Letters of gratitude they had written to their anonymous benefactor scrolled slowly down the screen. "I did this not out of guilt," Amara said, her voice thick with emotion for the first time, "but out of respect. Not to forget the past, but to build a better future from it. My actions have been about honoring a life. Mr. Vance's have been about avenging a death." The room was utterly silent. The secondary twist was a move of such profound moral power that it left no room for debate. It completely dismantled Vance's narrative of her as a careless monster. It exposed him as a man so consumed by a misplaced hatred that he couldn't see the grace that had been quietly honoring his sister's memory for a decade. He stood on the stage, utterly defeated, not by data, not by accusation, not by anger, but by integrity. He looked small, broken, a ghost haunted by a battle that had ended long ago. a battle he had been the only one still fighting. The coronation had become an abdication. The aftermath was swift and decisive. In the days following the board meeting, the carefully constructed world of Arthur Vance crumbled into dust. The board convened an emergency session, and, before the day was out, he was removed from all his positions. He submitted his resignation in disgrace, a brief, sterile letter that gave no hint of the decade-long drama that had culminated in his downfall. The media, which had been sniffing around the edges of the story, now had a narrative of breathtaking power, not one of petty corporate revenge, but of quiet integrity triumphing over obsessive hatred. Amara was lauded not as a victor, but as a paragon of grace under pressure. Her first meeting was with Ben Carter. They met in his cluttered office, the air between them still heavy with his recent betrayal. He looked older, worn down by the weight of his secret. "I was wrong, Amara," he said, his voice raspy. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was just being a coward. I should have told you. I should have trusted you to handle it." Amara looked at the man who had been her mentor, her friend. The anger had faded, replaced by a weary understanding. "You did what you thought was right, Ben. But from now on, we face things together. No more secrets." She reached across the desk and placed her hand on his. It was an absolution. He squeezed her hand, his eyes wet with tears of relief and pride. "I've never been prouder of you," he whispered, "not just for winning, but for how you won." Her next conversation was with Lena Ortiz. She found the young resident in the hospital library, poring over surgical texts. Amara sat down opposite her, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. Two women of color, at different stages of the same arduous journey. "The fellowship he offered you," Amara said gently. "It's still on the table. The committee has asked me to take over as its chair. The spot is yours, if you still want it." Lena's eyes widened. "But I thought—" "You thought wrong," Amara said with a small smile. "Leadership isn't about climbing over people. It's about building a foundation so strong that everyone has a chance to rise. You showed more integrity in 1 week than Vance did in a decade. That's the kind of doctor this hospital needs." In that moment, Amara wasn't just mentoring a resident. She was actively building the better, more ethical system she had fought for. She was planting the seeds of the future she envisioned. The hospital was in flux, a power vacuum waiting to be filled. The board, in a unanimous decision, offered Amara the interim CEO position. She had the moral authority, the respect of the staff, and the strategic mind to lead them out of the crisis. It was the logical conclusion, the ultimate prize. She turned it down without a moment's hesitation. 6 months later, the transformation of Metro General Hospital was not just palpable, it was structural. Amara had refused the CEO position because she knew that true change doesn't come from occupying the old seat of power, but from creating a new one. At her recommendation, the board had created a new, permanent C-suite role with unprecedented authority, chief medical ethicist, and head of institutional equity. The position came with board-level power to oversee patient care standards, staff conduct, and ethical protocols across the entire hospital network. It was a role designed not to manage budgets, but to protect the hospital's soul. This was the job she accepted. The final scene of the old conflict played out not in a boardroom or an operating theater, but on a bright, sunny afternoon in the heart of the community she had fought to protect. A dedication ceremony was being held for the newly expanded and renovated community outreach clinic, the one Vance had tried to shutter. It was now a state-of-the-art facility, bustling with patients and staff. A new bronze plaque was unveiled beside the entrance. It read, "The Eleanor Vance Community Wellness Center." It was Amara's final act of grace, a gesture that transformed a symbol of pain into a legacy of healing. Amara gave a short speech about second chances, about building bridges, and about how true healthcare meant caring for the entire community, not just the parts that were profitable. As the crowd applauded, she scanned the faces before her, and then she saw him. Standing at the very back of the crowd, away from the donors and politicians, was Arthur Vance. He was no longer the charismatic titan of industry. He was just a man, dressed in a simple sports coat, looking older and diminished. The fire of his hatred had been extinguished, leaving behind only the quiet ash of regret. Their eyes met across the distance. There was no triumph in her gaze, no lingering defeat in his. There was only a quiet, somber understanding, an acknowledgement of a shared, painful history that had, at last, been laid to rest. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the city. The ceremony concluded. The crowd began to disperse. A young woman approached Amara, her eyes shining with awe and excitement. She was a first-year medical student from the neighborhood, the newest recipient of the scholarship Amara had founded. "Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice trembling slightly, I wanted to thank you. I wouldn't be here without you." Amara smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. From the pocket of her coat, she took out a new stethoscope. She placed the earpieces into the student's ears and draped the bell around her neck. "The honor is all mine," Amara said. "Now, let's get to work." She was not just healing patients with her hands anymore. She was healing the very system that had once tried to break her, building a lasting legacy of compassion. One scholarship, one clinic, one future doctor at a time.